At first glance, the cortex of the brain seemed to be extremely chaotic, computations happening in non-linear fashion, and there is simply a lot going on. A lot of neurons are spiking and a lot of brainwaves activities are happening. Yet it somehow manages to miraculously keep the neural computations on track, where the neural activities converge into a stable sequence of states where it produces consistent computation, neural computation, despite all the distractions and all of the noises that it receives from the sensor system. In order to understand how this phenomena is possible, the neuroscience community obviously has been very active in conducting such research. However, traditionally in neuroscience community, we've been very focused on single spaces of neuron or single neurons. But most recently, especially in the past few years, thanks to the evolving technology, we are more equipped to study and track and measure as to how things are happening in the brain or the cortex of the brain holistically, meaning to say, do different regions talk to each other, and if so, how? In previous videos, we covered traveling waves, which are the brain waves that travel between or among different regions of the brain, and that is at the non-physical level. Today, we're going to add to that the physical part of the brain that appears to have a role at the physical, at the neuron level, where it has to do with the communication among different regions of the brain. At the physical level of the brain, there appears to be specific computational channels between different brain regions, where these computational channels or subspaces appear to let specific information in or prevent specific information from penetrating. These computational subspaces appear to route information to different regions, different spots in the brain, depending on what that information is. So somehow they know what information to pass along. These subspace communication channels seem to be extremely selective in terms of what information it routes downstream, for example. Once a communication subspace channel is computed and established between two regions of the brain, for example, depending on what information it chooses to route, that is what will get communicated between those two regions. Let's say you want to make a decision based on your auditory system at some level. Then this subspace then knows to route the information that is more geared towards the auditory information as opposed to, let's say, visual information. It is as if the neurons and the brain in general is very selective as to where to send the information at what point and to which region. Now, the traveling brain waves that we already talked about that happens between regions appear to also somehow correlate or be connected with these subspace channels of computationally established communication channels between the brain regions. It also appears that despite all these chaotic information exchange that is happening both at the physical as well as the non-physical level, the brain always has this characteristics of wanting to go to a stable situation. Not in a fact that it goes back to the stable situation that it was before, for example, a learning was happening, but more so that it appears that it absorbs information, processes it, in this case, through the subspace channels as well as the traveling waves channels, then it somehow learns what it needs to learn, for example, but then it wants to go back to an equilibrium state. It wants to still be stable, but it does not go back to the stable state that it was before, for example, a learning happened, or before, for example, working memory happened. It goes back to it being stable while it has learned or while it has worked with the working memory just most recently. And it appears that it gets its stability back, or it remains its dynamic characteristics by these rotational waves of neural spikes at the physical level and traveling brain waves at the non-physical brain level. And with rotation here, we mean that the neural spikes, they form a specific pattern that change in a stable manner and then goes back to its previous state. In other words, when progressive spike patterns organized, we see it as a rotation in these subspace channels, where these rotations are much larger right after a distraction to help bring back the neural spiking activity to its normal pattern. In other words, despite all of the distractions and noises, the brain appears to want to keep going back to its stable and equilibrium state. More importantly, these rotations at the physical level of the brain, at the neuron level of the brain, seem to correlate with the rotations at the non-physical level of the brain, aka the brain waves of the brain. It appears that these traveling waves, aka brain waves, that are also rotational, by the way, like the subspaces, control the communication and control these subspaces. They also establish a component of time to some extent, so that these information knows when to be routed within this physical subspace channel. We also kind of touched upon this when we talked about the spatial computing, if you remember a few videos back. But nonetheless, the very exciting part here is that the scientists are really, finally, we are getting the physical connected with the non-physical brain, aka the neuron activities with the brainwaves activities. And that is the extremely exciting part, because although these appear to be small steps, they are definitely getting us moved towards a much better understanding of the brain as a whole, because bringing in brain waves into the conversation is something that we haven't had a lot up until a few years back.